Our guest today, Neil Lanctots. He joins us. He's the author of Campy, The Two Lives of Roy Campanella. Neil, thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me on.
And I first want to start off with, you've written two other books, and I've flipped through, I went to the library this weekend and flipped through Negro League Baseball, The Rise and Ruin of a Black Institution. Very good read from what I've touched on so far. But this book about Roy Campanella, I'm very fascinated. First off, one of my favorite baseball players of all time. I was not born yet, but just some of the stories I've read already sound very, very good. What did you learn about Roy that really impressed you the most, and you thought, wow, this guy is really interesting?
I just thought he had a fascinating story. There's so much to his life. I mean, he was biracial. His mother was African American. His father was Italian. I don't know how they got together. This was in Philadelphia in the 1920s. So he grew up in a very different environment, although he basically was considered African American because in those days, if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered to be black. So he had a strange, very different, unique upbringing. He also loved baseball as a kid. He started playing professional baseball at age 15, which I think is just unbelievable. The Negro Leagues picked him up at age 15. And then he was among the first to integrate the major leagues right after Jackie Robinson. So he's in that crop of pioneers. And then there's the story of his car accident where he was paralyzed in a car accident. He was left quadriplegic at the age of 36 and spent the last half of his life in a wheelchair, and he became a very important symbol to people who were handicapped in this country. So there's just a lot to his story, and I found so much of it interesting in writing this book.
And we all know the story about Branch Rickey deciding to make Jackie Robinson the first African-American ball player, and Roy Campanella was the first catcher to be integrated into Major League Baseball. How much differently do you think baseball would have gone on in the late 1940s into the 50s if it had been Roy Campanella instead of Jackie Robinson being the first African-American?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I mean, a lot of people have asked that question. Campy certainly had a very different personality from Jackie. He was certainly a more friendly, laid-back kind of guy who was really very quick to win friends. Jackie was a more intense individual. On the other hand, some people suggest that Rickey was more inclined towards Robinson because of the skin color. Robinson was darker, so there was no question that this was a black man integrating the major leagues, whereas Campy, being biracial, was lighter. So some people say that may have had some impact as well. I think either of them, certainly Jackie was you can't do better than Jackie, how he performed, but I think Campy would have done very well had he been given the opportunity. And in fact, he almost was first in 1942, several years before Robinson, because the Pittsburgh Pirates during the war actually were talking about giving a black player a tryout during the war, and then they kind of backed off in the long run, and Campy didn't get that shot.
And I did read that as well. You pointed that out in the book, Neil, about how Campy could have been the first with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Why did the Pirates back off on that?
No one really knows. I mean, during the war, there was a lot of pressure on the major leagues to integrate because, we were fighting a war against fascism and Hitler and things like that, and people were saying, well, we can't have American baseball discriminating against 1/10 of the population. So a lot of pressure was put on baseball, and the commissioner of baseball, Landis, who never was really too favorably inclined towards integration, made a statement saying there was no rule against signing a black player. And the Pittsburgh Pirates took him on his word, and they said, we're going to offer tryouts to top Negro leaguers, and Roy Campanella will be one of them. And then somehow something happened. I'm not really sure. I think a lot of pressure was probably put on the Pirates not to go through with this, and they just backed off. And Campy didn't get that shot in 1942, and he wouldn't get a shot another 5 years, 6 years actually. So I think Campy was always aware that he might have been first before Jackie, but he didn't get that chance.
And we touched a little bit on Jackie Robinson and how he was the first African-American baseball player in Major League Baseball, but also you touch in the book about Roy Campanella and his relationship with Jackie Robinson. What was that like?
Yeah, that's another thing I found very interesting in doing this book, because these two men, they started out as friends. I mean, they both joined the Dodger organization at about the same time. Jackie was signed in October 45. He was the first, and then Campy was signed in the spring of 46. And they were very close in that when Campy got to the majors a year after Jackie, they roomed together. Their families were very close. They even bought houses in the same neighborhood in Queens. And things then fell apart over a couple different issues. One of the issues was about money. That's always a problem in some friendships. Jackie was going on a barnstorming trip, and he took Campy along. And, they would make certainly a large amount of money, but Campy found out in the middle of this trip that Jackie was being paid on a percentage basis and making a lot more than him. And Campy felt that Jackie was hogging all the money, and that was the first breach in their relationship. And then the second breach really dealt with civil rights issues, in that Jackie felt that he was a celebrity ball player, celebrity black ball player, and he should use his status to speak out about civil rights issues. And Campy and almost every other black player and black athlete in the 50s didn't want to do that. They felt they were very fortunate to be where they were, and they didn't want to speak out. And because of that, Campy and Jackie just stopped talking to one another altogether, and that relationship didn't get repaired until the 60s, when Campy started to change his attitudes a bit on that issue.
We're joined by Neil Lanctots. He's the author of Campy, The Two Lives of Roy Campanella. It's in local bookstores, and you can find it also at Amazon. And Neil, we talk about his playing career, and Campy, very impressive, 8-time All-Star as a catcher, 3-time NL MVP. But I think if a lot of people know Roy Campanella's name, they think, oh, wasn't he paralyzed in a car accident? And in the book, you go in detail about what happened, and you throw out a few theories. What's your theory as to what happened that January 1958 night?
Well, you know, when Campy had the accident, it was certainly spun a certain way in the newspapers and in his own autobiography, which came out about a year later. And it was told in a very cut-and-dry fashion that he was leaving his liquor store, driving home, and it was a snowy night, and the car crashed. I wasn't happy with that explanation, and when I started doing the research for this book, I started to see a lot of holes in the story. And the more people I talked to, the more flaws in the story started coming up. And in fact, one of the first things I learned, I was talking to one of Campy's associates on the Dodgers, Buzzy Bavasi, who was the general manager. And Bavasi told me, he said, Campy was somewhere he shouldn't have been that night, and that was the first clue that there was something more to the story. As it turned out, Campy left his liquor store, but then did not go directly home that night. He went to a nightclub, and then he went to the home of a girlfriend. He was having an affair at the time. His marriage was falling apart. So he went there, then drove home, and then fell asleep at the wheel, and his car crashed. Now, the interesting thing also about the accident, sort of the tragic thing, is that if he had had a seatbelt on, he probably would have walked away without a scratch. But in those days in the 50s, seatbelts were optional, so very few cars had them, and that's why he ended up being quadriplegic.
Wow, very interesting. And Neil, in your book, Campy, The Two Lives of Roy Campanella, I just look at the title, I think, Two Lives of Roy Campanella. It may sound like a dumb question, but what were the two lives of Roy Campanella?
Well, it's funny, a lot of people have speculated about that. That was not my title, that was the publisher's title. Some people say, are the two lives his life in the Negro Leagues and his life in the major leagues? I think what we meant by that title was his life in the wheelchair and his life out of the wheelchair, because he roughly spent, a lot of people don't realize, he was in a wheelchair for 35 years, and he lived to be the age of 71, so he almost spent exactly half of his life in that wheelchair, which is a very, very long time to live as a quadriplegic. Even today, if you think of Christopher Reeve, you know, he only lived less than 10 years with that accident. The reason being they get so many complications and so many infections that just killed him eventually. So he lived a long time in that chair, and that was his second life. And he did learn to adapt to being in the chair, although it was very difficult for him at first.
And Neil, I've read a number of reviews on your book, and everything is just very highly complimentary, talking about your research, dedicated. Although I did read that you tried to get a hold of Campy's children for almost 2 years, but then they told you they would not participate. Did that hurt your feelings? Was that a little disappointing?
It was disappointing in the sense that they also, I think, prevented me from talking to some people. I think there were some individuals who were not comfortable talking to me without the authorization of the Campanella family. So I think that was a little bit of an issue. The Campanellas, I did speak to them many, many times about trying to get them on board with this project, and I think they just didn't want to lend authorization to something they didn't have control over. I think they were afraid there might be some things in the book they might not like, and they just didn't want to do it. So I was disappointed, but I don't think it detracted from the final product of the book.
Excellent. Neil Lanctots, right here on Miller on Sports, the author of Campy, The Two Lives of Roy Campanella. You can pick it up in bookstores right now. Neil, it was a pleasure, and thanks so much.